In this lecture, we're going to continue on with Chapter 10. So we've been talking about aversive control, and specifically we've been talking about avoidance, and we will eventually work our way up to talking about punishment. But we had left off not quite wanting to get into talk of extinction. So today we're going to begin with extinction of avoidance behavior through response blocking and CS alone exposure. Now, early on, the easiest way to start engaging in extinction was to just unplug the shock generator that was attached to the shuttle box apparatus. The problem that you might be seeing with this, from what we've just spent the last couple of slides learning about, is that unplugging that shock generator will sort of remove our unconditioned stimulus, the shock, from our equation, but it leaves everything else as part of that setup pretty much untouched, which means that the avoidance response of, say, running to the other side of the shuttle box enclosure would still turn off the conditioned stimulus. So it would still either turn off the light or the tone that was signaling that a shock was coming. And if you remember, what we had just learned from the previous slides was that it isn't the delivery of the shock itself that's maintaining this avoidance behavior. It's actually the escape of fear that comes from turning off that conditioned stimulus. So it should come as no surprise that when this method was used, when they just disconnected the shock generator but left everything else the same, the avoidance response ended up persisting for a really long time. So this was a very poor way of going through extinction for that avoidance behavior because the conditioned stimulus was still present and still being turned off by the avoidance response. So it wasn't actually targeting what we were intending to target with the extinction behavior. The extinction process. Now, if we make some real-world connections here, this could be applied to, say, clinical settings. So if somebody has developed a fear of something, and that fear is being maintained by avoiding situations in which they might encounter that fear, then we're seeing something kind of like this, where their behavior of avoiding that situation is kind of like turning off that conditioned stimulus by leaving. So if someone has a fear of heights and they just avoid going to tall places, so that's kind of like being able to turn off the conditioned stimulus of being in a tall building. So to try and actually extinguish the avoidance behavior, what we have to do is somehow change our relationship with this conditioned stimulus. And that's where our blocking response and CS alone exposure comes into effect. Now, response blocking, which is also called flooding, is basically preventing a participant from making the avoidance response and forcing them to be exposed to our conditioned stimulus. So in our shuttle box setup, if you blocked the opening between the two halves of the shuttle box setup, I guess. So if you block that door that connects the two sides of the chamber, that would be response blocking. Because if the animal is on, say, the right side of the chamber, and the light comes on to tell them that the floor on the right side is going to be shocked, they have no way of going to the other side. Now, if your intention is to extinguish that avoidance behavior, what you would do is have that conditioned stimulus come on, you would have the light turn on, but you wouldn't follow it up with the shock. You would remove the unconditioned stimulus from the equation. So we are forcing them to be exposed to that conditioned stimulus, and we're showing them that that conditioned stimulus is no longer followed by the unconditioned stimulus. That's why it's called CS alone exposure, because you're being exposed to the CS on its own with no US present. And so some of the things we should make note of for this setup, the longer we're exposed to that CS without the US, the better the extinction. The number of trials doesn't really matter. So it doesn't matter if you have 5 exposure trials or 10 exposure trials. The important part is the duration overall. So you usually do see an association between number of trials and extinction, but that's only because more trials usually means longer time. If you control for the amount of time that they spend exposed to that CS without the US, the number of trials doesn't actually matter. So you're a lot better off having longer exposures than you are to have more exposures. And this basic setup can be used to treat phobias and anxieties. So things like being afraid of heights. If you were forced to experience sort of sitting in a very high place, and you're forced to face the fact that there is no unconditioned stimulus, there is no falling feeling. So you're just experiencing the conditioned stimulus of being in a high place, and you could feel that fear but realize that there is no actual falling sensation, then you could lessen your fear response and therefore start experiencing extinction of the avoidance behavior. You could stop avoiding going into high places as you get used to that conditioned stimulus of being in a high place without feeling falling or anything scary like that. And this slide is just a graph showing a relationship between the trials to extinction criterion, basically how many exposures they needed to have to that conditioned stimulus in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus to stop displaying the avoidance behavior versus the total blocking time. So this is basically showing us that as we have more and more blocking time, so as our exposures get longer and longer, we need fewer and fewer trials to start showing that extinction behavior. So it's the total blocking time, not just the number of trials, that's driving this. And as I said, this concept is very important for behavior therapies to try and deal with people who have phobias, to help them handle phobias or anxiety in general. And we can use a flooding procedure where we have extinction, exposure to the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus being present. And it's also a good idea to prevent the response from occurring. So if you can prevent that avoidance behavior from occurring, those two combined is going to give you the best outcome. And of course, I have some YouTube videos dealing with some of the concepts that we're going to be covering today. So if you check out our e-class, I've linked a couple of relevant videos, so it might be a good idea to take some time and go over some of those if you can. Now, up until this point, we've been talking about the two-process theory and experimental setups that kind of go along with the two-process theory. That theory insists that the warning signal, our conditioned stimulus, is critical to avoidance learning. But what if we sort of expanded on that idea? What if there's a time when there is no external warning stimulus? What if there isn't a conditioned stimulus that tells us that an aversive stimulus is coming? This brings us to the idea of non-discriminated avoidance or free operant avoidance. In this free operant procedure, we have a setup where unsignaled shocks can be avoided by making a response within a set period from the previous response and or shock. Basically, we're going to have two independent, semi-independent time intervals. We can have our SS interval, which is our shock interval. And actually, for those of you who are visual learners, we can look at the visual representation of this here while we talk about it. I'll just flip back and forth between these two slides. But if we look just at the shocks here, we have our SS interval, which is saying that each of these ticks means that a shock is being delivered. So we can say that this SS interval is, 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, there's going to be a shock delivered. And that shock is delivered sort of at the end of that 10-second period, unless, of course, our second time interval comes into play. And this is our response shock interval, or RS interval. So this says that if you make some kind of operant response, say you push a button or pull a lever or whatever the experiment deems it necessary for you to do, then you create a period of safety. So this response shock interval is basically telling us how much time you then don't receive a shock for. So we had a shock delivered here and here and here, but before another shock could be delivered, this response was made, which cancels the next delivery of shock. And then we have that period during which there is no shock delivered up here because you made that response. After that RS interval has ended, then we go back to our normal delivery of shocks. So shock was delivered here and here again, but as soon as you make that response again, it resets this response shock interval. And here we see that making a response here and then making another one here, making that second response basically just resets that response shock interval. So what we can take from this is if you made this response fairly frequently, if every time before this response shock interval ended, you made another response, then you could indefinitely avoid being shocked. So once you've learned that this response creates a safe period, as long as you keep making this response before that safe period ends, you can stay in a safe period pretty much indefinitely. Now, for this free operant procedure to work, it has to be done with a species that has some idea or concept of time, because they would need to give this response during this response shock interval. So they have to kind of be maybe aware of the passage of time. So it's been employed fairly effectively in humans and dogs, maybe even some evidence in pigeons, but there's definitely going to be more research on this in the future. Now, before we move on from our two-process theory and then our free operant idea, we want to focus on some difficulties that we should maybe keep in mind, just some things that might cause problems when we're actually looking at avoidance behaviors in the real world. So the first of these problems is that it can be very difficult to extinguish fear avoidance because when we feel that fear, we tend to very quickly go through those avoidance behaviors. So someone who's afraid of heights will very quickly nope out of an elevator to avoid going to a very high place. An animal that has learned that a signal is warning of an upcoming foot shock will very quickly run to the other side of the shuttle container. So avoidance can happen very, very quickly and doesn't always give us an opportunity to extinguish it. So you have to carefully control the environment and the situation in order to employ extinction. So it's not always easy to undo or counteract, I suppose, our fear avoidance learning. Another thing that we need to consider is that sometimes that avoidance behavior has become habit. So the conditioned response might no longer be present. So you might not feel fear, but you've gotten in the habit of avoiding tall places. And so we'd have to think of a different way to sort of undo that learned habit. Okay, so the textbook also goes over a couple of other theoretical accounts of avoidance behavior. These are a little bit less prominent in the field, but each of them has had different studies that give at least some evidence that they might be involved in avoidance behavior. So the first of these is positive reinforcement through conditioned safety signals. Now, this idea is based on the safety signal hypothesis, and it effectively states that as we make these conditioned responses, as we run to the other side of the shuttle experiment enclosure, then we learn that making that response gives us a period of safety. And knowing that we have this safe period can itself become reinforcing, because doing that behavior means that we know we won't receive any kind of aversive stimulus for a set amount of time. So those stimuli that let us know that we are now safe can be called safety signals, and they serve as positive reinforcers. We may also see some element of negative reinforcement by reducing the frequency of shocks that are experienced. So even though our two-process theory didn't really like the idea of reduction of shock being directly involved in maintaining those avoidance behaviors, they might be involved at some level. So they shouldn't be completely counted out. Another factor to consider would be species-specific defense reactions, which are basically innate or naturally occurring responses to particular aversive stimuli that occur because they have evolved to occur. So an example of this would be that a species-specific defense reaction, say for a rat, when shocked would be to run. So their natural response to receiving a foot shock would be to run away from that shock. So we tend to see running behaviors happen naturally or innately when our aversive stimulus is a shock. So this point or this theory tells us to keep in mind what innate reactions might exist, because the fact that they're innate reactions and not necessarily learned responses might affect what we're seeing when we're setting up avoidance behaviors. And this idea kind of carries over into our next point, which is to consider predatory imminence. Basically saying that our species-specific defense reactions might vary, so we might have different reactions based on where in our set of behaviors in response to, say, a predator attack, the stimulus might be encountered. So if we have something like a shock, so a painful stimulus would be close to, say, you are actively being attacked by a predator. So we would expect behavioral responses, so innate reactions, to be related to actively escaping from a predator. But if we have a stimulus that's, say, more removed from the active attack of a predator, or maybe if you have something that's warning of a predator incoming, you might see different behavioral responses. So if we had a sound that might be warning of an upcoming attack, then we might see hiding behavior rather than running behavior. So this is just another sort of bringing in our biological relevance and telling us that we should maybe consider what natural behaviors our responses might be more closely related to. So consider what our aversive stimuli might be related to, and consider what innate responses to those aversive stimuli might be related to in the natural environment that that organism has evolved in. Our last point is actually kind of in the opposite direction to everything else that we've pointed out here. So the idea of expectancy theory kind of flies in the face of our other proposed theories. So the first four were described as fairly low level in terms of cognitive involvement. So these are either innate occurrences or things that have been learned through experience. But none of these first four require us to assume any kind of active cognitive appraisal. So the first four, we're not saying that the organism is thinking about what is going to happen. We are just talking about associations that have been learned or responses that happen due to innate biological drives. Whereas expectancy theory kind of takes us in the other direction. And researchers that work with expectancy theory start looking at what organisms come to anticipate or expect. So there's some kind of thought process involved when you evaluate things with expectancy theory. So you might look at, okay, does our conditioned stimulus lead to an expectation of shock? And how can we reduce that expectation? And how does a reduction in that expectation change the behavior? So this is just a very different type of theory, and we don't spend more time than just this quick little blurb on this, but it's a good idea to be aware of the existence of this theory. And I'm just looking ahead at my slides, and I'm realizing I've done it again, where I've talked around my sort of introduction points here, not realizing that I had actual slides with the words that go along with what I was saying on the next couple of slides. So I apologize that I've done that. Basically, I talked around all of these points while on this slide. So you might have noticed that if you have the slides in front of you, but as I was talking about each of these points, there's actually more wordy descriptions here that line up with what I just said. So yeah, apparently I already covered these, so you can compare the two or sort of work ahead in your slides there rather than sitting on the one slide I was just stuck on. All right, so with that little flub out of the way, we can move on to a summary of what we've talked about for avoidance up to this point in the chapter. So we now can figure out that no one theory actually explains all aspects of avoidance behavior. So each of them seems to have some evidence and some support, and in reality, what we're probably seeing is a combination of multiple of these theories working together. So no one theory is an absolute right answer, and a lot of situations are going to be more complicated and probably involve multiple of our theories. So of all the theories that we've talked about, they all might have some involvement and some aspect of correctness. To that end, we can talk about our two-process theory as explaining the results of escape from fear. So our two-process theory works best when we're trying to explain when we observe escape from fear type behavior. Our safety signal hypothesis is very useful in explaining our free operant avoidance procedures. Our predatory eminence theory explains what happens during the early stages of avoidance training. And our expectancy theory does a good job explaining the cognitive aspects of avoidance theory. So a lot more readily applied to humans, where we can actually evaluate our cognitive processes, but there are some people who are trying to apply expectancy theory to other species. Not that everyone agrees with it. Now, during our discussion of avoidance behaviors, I did mention the idea of disorders, phobias, and anxiety. So I wanted to take just a very brief moment here to talk about how some of our anxiety disorders or phobias might be maintained through some of the processes that we've talked about so far. So if we have something like agoraphobia, which is a fear of open spaces, our conditioned stimulus for someone with agoraphobia would be any kind of open space or crowded area. And that tends to be an overgeneralization. There might have been an incident in a very large open space or a very crowded area that originally started this phobia, but over time it has overgeneralized to any open space or any crowded area. So our conditioned stimulus could be pretty much any space and anywhere with people. And our response that is performed to avoid or not experience the fear associated with that conditioned stimulus is to stay inside and avoid open spaces and crowds. And this response is negatively reinforced because staying inside, doing that response, removes that fear. So you're removing that feeling of fear, and so it is now negatively reinforcing, meaning that you're more likely to stay inside in the future. So, of course, that cycle leads to you staying inside more and more and more. For something like OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, you have a conditioned stimulus of the obsession, the thing that you are being sort of driven to do. So you have an intrusive thought that says that you need to lock your door. So a thought that my doors are unlocked, I need to lock them. And so that leads to a response, a compulsion of repeatedly locking and checking that the doors are locked. And again, we see that doing this response can lead to a reduction in fear, which then becomes negatively reinforced because doing this behavior reduces that fear. So in both cases, these behaviors are negatively reinforced and they maintain themselves through that negative reinforcement. Okay, so before we move on into punishment, I want to take a moment and make sure that you can all tell the difference between avoidance, escape, and punishment. So just remember that avoidance is a situation where an individual has to make a specific response to prevent an aversive stimulus from occurring. As a real-world example, you might hold a handrail to avoid slipping and falling down the stairs. I also use the example of maybe you leave the room if you know your fire alarm is going to go off from making toast in the morning. For escape, this would involve an individual making a specific response to stop an actively occurring aversive stimulus. So this is running to the other side of the shuttle box once the shock has begun. Or maybe leaving the room after your fire alarm has started going off because you made toast poorly. Next, we're going to talk about punishment, which we've kind of mentioned very, very briefly as, what it is and how it exists and fits into our positive and negative punishment and reinforcement setup. But the rest of the chapter, we're going to delve a lot deeper into punishment. But for the basic idea here, for punishment, our target response actively produces the aversive outcome. So punishment should lead to a decrease in that instrumental response. You should do that behavior less because it leads to an aversive outcome. Whereas with avoidance and escape, making that response is actually leading to a better situation, and in both escape and avoidance, you should come to do that instrumental response more frequently. So let's actually move on and talk about punishment. As a refresher of some of our terms before we get started, I want to remind you that negative reinforcement involves an increase in the behavior due to the removal of a consequence. So negative means you're removing something. Reinforcement means that our behavior is increasing. So this would be an instance of running to the other side of the shuttle box to escape a shock. So we're removing a bad thing by doing that behavior, which means that the behavior will be more likely to occur in the future. What we're going to be looking at for the rest of the chapter are positive and negative punishment. Now, both are punishment procedures, which means that our behavior is going to decrease. In positive punishment, that behavior decreases due to the presence of a consequence. So something bad happens, which makes you less likely to do that behavior. For negative punishment, the behavior is going to decrease due to the removal of a consequence. So this is usually you're removing something good, which means that you're less likely to do that behavior because you don't want to lose that good thing. If we want practical examples of each of these, positive punishment could be something like the delivery of a shock. So if pushing a button leads to the delivery of a shock, you're going to be less likely to push that button. For negative punishment, this would be like pushing the button costs you money. So you lose money, which is a good thing. So you would be less likely to push that button because you don't want to lose money. Now, hopefully anytime I have mentioned the existence and use of punishment, I've also made you aware of the fact that there are some ethical considerations, as well as some practical considerations that we need to keep in mind. So most of what we've focused on in this course so far has been on the reinforcement side of things, and we're going to get into why reinforcement tends to be the preferred and most widely used type of behaviors, or type of procedures, I guess. We're going to talk about the circumstances where it might be justified or beneficial to use punishment, but just be aware that there needs to be a lot of considerations and there needs to be a lot of planning and justification if punishment is ever going to be used. So first off, we can talk about some typical examples of aversive stimuli. A lot of these are things that are used for, say, experiments. We've talked a lot about electric shock, and early on when we started talking about electric shock, I made sure to specify that they tend to use a fairly mild shock. They don't want to cause physical and permanent damage. They just want to cause discomfort. Same idea with a burst of air, something that would be startling but not necessarily painful. A loud noise, again, startling but not necessarily causing permanent hearing damage. We could have verbal reprimands as aversive stimuli. Maybe a parent scolding a child would fall under this category. There are more extreme examples, things like injury, where you're causing physical harm. Obviously, that is not a good thing to use when you're trying to set up or modify behaviors, but it does happen. Less intensive, you could use something like a bitter taste, something that's, again, unpleasant but not harming or damaging. Or we can use conditioned stimuli, something that has become associated with, say, one of these, with either fear or pain. But if you use a conditioned stimulus instead, then the individual is not consistently exposed to fear or pain directly. So as I've said, there are a lot of ethical considerations that need to be kept in mind when you're trying to decide on what kind of aversive stimulus to be using. It is a lot more acceptable and a lot easier to ethically justify something like negative punishment. It's a little bit easier to remove something good than it is to actively give something bad. So we tend to see things like timeout or an increase in response cost, which would fall under the umbrella of negative punishment. And as a reminder, negative punishment means you're removing a stimulus to cause a decrease in that behavior. So usually you're removing access to something good. So with timeout, this is the removal of reinforcers or availability of reinforcers. Basically, you see this a lot with children, where you would have a child who's doing a bad behavior, and when that bad behavior occurs, you'd remove them from the situation, get them to sit in the corner, get them to sit in another room, where they no longer have access to something that they were enjoying. So if a child is playing a video game and gets violent, then maybe you remove their access to playing that game. So you've removed that reinforcer, you've taken away something that they were enjoying. Our considerations here are that the timeout itself needs to actually remove the availability of those reinforcers. So if a child is getting enjoyment from being loud and boisterous and you get them to sit in the corner, but they're still able to hear all of the other children in the area being loud and boisterous, that situation might still be reinforcing. So that would be a really bad timeout because they're not actually being removed from those reinforcing stimuli. In that situation, you'd be better off putting them in a different room where they no longer have that social reinforcement. So in order to implement timeout, you need to consider what exactly it is that's reinforcing this behavior and make sure that they aren't able to still get that reinforcement while they're in timeout. Now, most timeout scenarios tend to work better if they're kept very short in duration. So a child acting out, maybe they get a 3-minute timeout, and then they're allowed to go back to that reinforcing behavior. They can go back to playing their video game, but if they act out again, if they do the bad behavior, then they'd be put back into timeout. Another type of negative punishment would be an increase of response cost. And so for response cost, this says that contingent on a problem behavior occurring, a specified amount of reinforcer is removed, which basically means that if a problem behavior happens, then something good is taken away because of that problem behavior having occurred. So we can have something like speeding tickets. So if you do the problem behavior, if you go too fast, then you lose money. So it makes it a lot more costly to do that bad behavior and should lead to that behavior occurring less and less. So getting a speeding ticket should reduce the amount of speeding that people do. Now, of course, we might also see instances of positive punishment. Though most positive punishment that we tend to encounter in academic settings and in the literature are going to be things that are maybe not what we immediately call to mind when we think of positive punishment. For example, I've pointed out that a lot of the literature we've discussed where we're looking at shock as a positive punishment in some kind of experiment, a lot of those experiments tend to be older. So they tend not to occur as often more recently as we become more stringent with our ethics and ethical considerations. So we tend to use a little bit less positive punishment unless there's a really good reason for using it. What we tend to see instead is something like overcorrection, which is still a form of positive punishment, but isn't as damaging, I guess. So overcorrection is a form of positive punishment where the individual has to engage in some kind of effortful behavior whenever they engage in the problem behavior. So if a child throws a temper tantrum and throws their toys all around the room, an overcorrection strategy would require them to not only correct their mistake of throwing all those toys around, but to go beyond that. So maybe instead of just getting them to clean up their toys, maybe they have to clean up another room or something else that was out of place in that room. So you get them to overcorrect the problems that were caused by their problem behavior. Another example would be a child drawing on the walls. So that's a problem behavior. And an overcorrection form of positive punishment would be for them to have to clean the walls so that there's no more coloring on the walls. But instead of just cleaning the walls that they drew on, maybe they have to clean all of the walls of that room. So getting them to do something effortful as a consequence of the bad behavior that they engaged in. There's also a subset of overcorrection where instead of just doing a behavior that corrects or rectifies the mistake that came from that problem behavior, they could just have to do something effortful that isn't directly related to the bad behavior. So something like writing lines. So you're doing something effortful, so you have to write out the same words over and over again, but the act of writing might not be directly related to the bad behavior that was exhibited. But this is positive punishment because you're being forced to do something that is effortful because of the bad behavior that you did. So there is an introduction of an aversive stimulus, something that requires effort because of the behavior that was exhibited, and the hope is that it's punishing, so it should result in a reduction in the behavior that led to that effortful behavior being given to you. A convenient and commonly used way to study aversive stimuli with humans is to use something like a point loss experiment. So we can look at punishment with humans without actually having to deliver a physically aversive stimulus. So in this experiment, to set up the idea of an aversive stimulus, we first have to give these humans exposure to a system where they can earn points. So what they're using here are two different kinds of stimuli, two different stimuli. We have a discriminative stimulus and a punishment stimulus, which is labeled as an SD with a subscript P. So what these are is basically two different sized lines. So we have a short line and a long line. And for these, one of them is going to be reinforced. So during the baseline, they're only presented with one type of line. So we would have, say, only short lines are presented, and they would press a button whenever they see this short line. And the pressing of that button whenever they see a short line would be reinforced on a variable interval schedule. So they would earn points over time, and they would be told that they could trade in their points later on in order to get, say, money from the experimenters. So these points become a good thing, something that they want to accumulate in order to get more money at the end. So in our baseline, we basically get them to build up a collection of points by responding to just the discriminative stimulus, just our short line. Next, we enter the point loss phase. And now they're exposed to both our original discriminative stimulus, the one that is reinforced on a variable interval schedule, but now we also introduce our second stimulus, our punishment stimulus. And if they respond to this punishment stimulus, now they lose points. So we're introducing that punishment aspect because they're losing something that was good. And so here we can see that they continue to respond at a fairly high level to our originally reinforced stimulus because it's still being reinforced, but we see much lower responding to our punishment stimulus. So they've learned that they shouldn't respond to this punishment stimulus because they lose points, but they can still respond to the discriminative stimulus because they can still gain points. And there are two graphs here just because they're showing individual data. So this is showing that two different individuals both show higher responding to our discriminative stimulus and lower responding to our punishment stimulus. So as I said, this or a setup similar to this is fairly common if we're trying to study punishment in humans. Now, if we're considering aspects that influence the effectiveness of punishment, we want to also consider things like punisher intensity. So we've found through multiple studies that stronger punishers produce a greater decrease in behavior. However, there are some caveats or exceptions to this statement. So stronger punishers tend to produce greater decreases in behavior unless we see these situations. So the first of these is a ceiling effect, where basically, depending on what kind of punisher you're using, there's going to be a maximum amount of reduction in behavior that you can observe. So let's consider a theoretical situation in which we have a child who's touching a hot pot or something like that. So we can look at a graph of sort of the behavior of touching, so that touching behavior, I guess we can call that TB. And then along this axis, let's have our temperature. So temperature, I'm just going to put degrees Celsius so we know that this T is different than that T. Okay, so as our temperature goes up, we're going to see less and less touching behavior. So the child will learn very quickly that touching that pot gets very, very hot. And so at a certain point, probably right where it starts to become painful, the child will stop touching that pot. So even if we continue increasing the temperature of the pot, we're not going to see any more of a decrease in that behavior, because we've hit the ceiling, we've hit that sort of maximum decrease possible for that behavior. So we need to consider a ceiling effect based on whatever our punisher is for that situation. We should also consider the importance of the appropriate level of punisher intensity. So based on individuals' previous experience or based on the situation, the intensity of a punisher could depend or be more or less effective based on all those other factors. So if we consider something like a punisher as time in jail, so for someone who has never had any kind of jailing in the past, even something as small as a day or 2 days in jail might be a very effective punisher. But for someone who's been incarcerated for long periods of time, a day or two in jail is nothing and therefore doesn't even serve as a punisher for them. So we need to consider what is an appropriate level of punishment based on that individual and that circumstance. This leads us to the idea that a punisher should be intense enough to stop a behavior when it occurs. So you want to decrease the occurrence of that behavior by using this particular punisher. And again, leads us to the next point, which is that if you start with a punisher that is too low intensity and slowly ramp up to higher and higher intensities, you sometimes find that they become accustomed or habituated, I guess, to that lower level intensity of punisher, and even a slight increase in punisher intensity doesn't really have any effect. So if we look at something like a shock, if you start with too mild of a shock that doesn't disrupt the behavior, and you slowly increase the intensity of that shock, the animal might continue to just ignore that shock and can come to tolerate much higher levels of shock or higher punisher intensity than they would have if you had just started with a higher level of shock to begin with. So this is something where you need to be very aware of what an appropriate level of intensity is to start at, because you run into this issue where you might have to use much higher level intensities if you don't start off on the right foot. Another factor that we should probably consider is the idea of contingent versus independent aversive stimulation. Now, what we've been talking about so far in relation to punishment is contingent aversive stimulation, where our aversive event occurs because of the behavior that's been done. So you get a speeding ticket because you've been speeding, or an animal receives a shock because they pressed a lever at the wrong time. Contingent aversive stimulation tends to decrease the occurrence of that behavior. But we've also mentioned earlier on in the course the fact that independent aversive stimulation can also cause a reduction in operant responding for different reasons. So if we have independent aversive stimulation, we're saying that the aversive event occurs regardless of the behavior of the organism. So this would be something like random delivery of shocks that are unavoidable. And as we saw, I believe, back in chapter 3, when we were talking about conditioned suppression effect, the occurrence of aversive events in the environment can lead to an overall suppression of different operant behaviors. So rats are less likely to pull levers or push buttons or whatever if they're under the threat of the delivery of some kind of aversive stimulus. So they tend to show freezing behaviors and suppression of movement because of those aversive events. So we need to be aware that if aversive events are being delivered independent of that behavior, then we might still see some kind of suppression. So we need to be aware of whether the aversive stimulation is contingent on our behavior or independent of that behavior, because they both adjust behavior in different ways using different mechanisms. All right, the next thing that we want to consider is delayed punishment. And this concept is very similar to when we talked about delay of reinforcement, where as there is a delay in time, the value of a reinforcer tends to drop off fairly quickly. So if we have value here and time here, the longer the delay is, the less value we give to a reinforcer. The same thing applies to punishers. So an immediate punisher is a lot more intense and paid a lot more attention to, or I guess we can say it has a higher value than the same intensity of punisher, but off in the far future. So as there's a time delay, we sort of devalue that punishment. So it has a less strong effect on our behavior if it occurs after a delay of time. Now, this devaluing is actually a big problem, because if you don't immediately detect that a behavior has occurred, then you might be slow in delivering punishment for the occurrence of that behavior. And if there is a delay, it's a lot harder for the organism that is being punished to associate that punishment with the behavior that led to the punishment. So the more of a delay there is, the less likely they form that association between the behavior and the punishment. They don't assume an association, and so the punisher is going to be a lot less effective because it doesn't lead to a decrease in that behavior. Similarly, if every time that behavior occurs, there isn't a punishment that is delivered, then they don't necessarily form a strong association between the behavior and the consequence of that behavior. So if you can't deliver punishment quickly and consistently, then sometimes it's better not to deliver punishment at all, because it's not going to give you the outcome that you're desiring. And on that train of thought, we should talk about schedules of punishment, where basically, like schedules of reinforcement, we look at how often or how consistently punishment is delivered. So just like the idea that we could deliver reinforcement intermittently, we can also deliver punishment intermittently. But the different ratios, the different schedules that we use for delivery of punishment can affect basically how the behavior changes. So for this graph here, we're looking at cumulative number of responses. So a higher value here means that they are doing the conditioned response or the operant response a lot more often. Lower score means that they're performing that behavior less often. And then this axis is just time as per usual. So our first line here is there's no punishment. So if there is no punishment for performing that action, then they're going to perform that action fairly often and fairly quickly. So pretty steep slope. If we look at the other extreme, our FR1 down at the bottom here, so a fixed ratio 1, meaning that for every occurrence of the behavior, it is immediately punished. We see that the behavior occurs less frequently. So a less steep line here where very few occurrences or cumulative responses are occurring over that amount of time. And as there is sort of more space or more occurrence of that behavior that isn't being punished, we see an increase in this slope. So basically, if you are punished every single time you do that behavior, then you learn very quickly not to do the behavior. But if you're only punished every 500 or every 1,000 times you do that behavior, then there's a lot less connection between doing that behavior and receiving the punishment. It is interesting to note that even on a fixed ratio of 1,000, meaning that every 1,000 responses, 1 in every 1,000 responses was being punished, we still actually do see some decrease in that responding behavior. So this slope is not as steep as a no punishment situation. So we do still see a reduction in that behavior, even if only 1 out of 1,000 of the responses is being punished, but it's still not as sort of dramatic of a decrease in that responding behavior as if there was every single response being punished. So the delivery of punishment can also affect how quickly that behavior decreases. The next factor that we want to consider is the fact that most of these behaviors are occurring because they are reinforced or because the behavior itself is reinforcing. In most punishment situations, the target response is simultaneously maintained by a schedule of reinforcement and some kind of punishment that we're trying to deliver. As a real-world example for humans, if you think of dress codes. So you might be punished for violating a dress code by being given detention. But at the same time, wearing clothes that go against the dress code might be socially reinforced by peers. Another example, and a very commonly studied example, would be the use of drugs. So people tend to continue taking drugs even if there are negative or punishing outcomes of taking drugs. So they will continue to take drugs even if they have lost their job and their home and their health. So there's a combination of both reinforcing and punishing factors involved in most situations. So we do need to also consider the reinforcement side of things. So if we want to have effective punishment, if we want to effectively decrease the occurrence of a problem behavior, we generally need to try and remove or at least minimize that reinforcement side of the equation. So keeping this in mind, we might want to choose our punishers or our aversives a little bit more carefully. We want to make sure that any punisher that's being used isn't actually reinforcing as well. So something like scolding a child in front of their peers, while that might be aversive in that they are being scolded, there might also be a reinforcing side of that if their friends think that them acting out is also cool. So when the parent leaves after scolding the child, if the friends all laugh and joke about it, then that scolding wasn't just a punisher, it was also reinforcing. So instead, what you could do is change that situation up so that maybe you don't scold them in front of others. You would only scold them in a place where they're by themselves, where you remove that reinforcing part of the situation. Another thing that you can do is reduce the motivation for that bad reinforcement. So in our example of a child being positively reinforced by their peers supporting them after being scolded, maybe you can change their perception of their peers. If you can get them to see their peers as, I don't know, a bad influence where their opinion doesn't matter, then you can reduce that reinforcement side of things. Kind of stretching for an example here, but same basic idea. Another good course of action would be to allow for alternate behavior that produces reinforcement. So instead of having their only reinforcement come from sort of tagging along with the punishment behavior, maybe you give them something else that gives them that reinforcement instead. So maybe if you're scolding them for doing something bad, maybe also include praise for something that they've done well. So move where that reinforcement is coming from to some other alternate behavior. So behaving well instead of behaving poorly, or something like that. So this graph is just an example of what we might expect to see for behavioral data if we had punishment, no punishment, no punishment, punishment with no alternative response available, and punishment with an alternative response available. So our usual setup here, cumulative responses, so how much they're doing that behavior, and then time. So we can use an example of, say, you have a rat in a box and there are two levers. So if there is no punishment, they're going to push the levers pretty much independently. So lots of responding, no detriment to responding. If one of the levers is linked to a very loud noise and the other lever is locked, meaning they can't press it at all, we're still going to see some lever pressing. So this is punishment, but there's nothing else that they can do. There's no alternative response available. So they're still going to press the lever even though it leads to an aversive stimulus of noise. But if we make the other lever also available, so they can press either lever, either the one that produces a loud aversive sound or the one that does nothing, we're going to see a lot less of that aversive lever being pulled and a lot more of pressing the other lever. By giving them an alternative response, they would choose to do the alternative response over the aversive response, or the response that leads to an aversive outcome. And so in real world examples, we can look at the example of, say, kids in small towns are thought to do a lot more drugs or to smoke more or to get into more trouble. So the idea here is that they tend to do those bad things because there's nothing else for them to do. There's no alternative response available. So they'll do the bad things even though it gets them in trouble because they have nothing else to do with their time. And this pattern of responding is shown across lots of different examples between humans and rats and a bunch of things in between. So it's pretty well known that having alternative sources of reinforcement helps reduce the occurrence of those problem behaviors. The next factor that we want to consider when looking at the effectiveness of punishment is the sensitivity to the reinforcer. So we're still considering this reinforcing component of that punishing scenario. So what we can do is look at two different kinds of reinforcers that might be maintaining a behavior. So these graphs are from an experiment that looked at two different reinforcers, one reinforcer being cocaine and one being sucrose, both of which are very reinforcing for rats. But in this instance, they found that rats would persist in seeking out cocaine, even if the act of seeking cocaine led to the delivery of a punisher. But they would not continue seeking out sucrose if seeking sucrose resulted in the delivery of that punisher. So we could interpret these as saying that our sucrose wasn't reinforcing enough to overcome that punishing part of the equation, but the cocaine was reinforcing enough to overcome the punishers. Okay, now we are getting close to the end of this chapter, but the next couple of slides are going to link together and need quite a bit of conversation around them. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the last, I think it's 15 slides of this chapter, and we'll do the same thing that we did last week, where we sort of carried over the last couple of slides, and I'll do a short video covering just the tail end of chapter 10 on Tuesday, and then we'll continue with chapter 11 afterwards.